I want to welcome everybody tonight. My name's Barbara Grosh. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester metro area. And we have some really interesting material to discuss tonight. We invited all of the leagues in New York to join us because this is a statewide issue. So I think we'll keep it as a meeting rather than a webinar because maybe we'll have some good discussion after the presentation. So I would ask you to keep your sound muted until such time as you want to ask a question. So just because we have people from other places, you might want to put in the chat where in New York you're from. So we can get a sense and our speakers will know who they're talking to. So this webinar will be recorded and it will appear on our YouTube channel within a few days. All right, so I'm going to introduce Jill Paperno, who's my contact for this, and let you take it away. So go for it, Jill.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for having us tonight. We're very excited to speak to you. I'm Jill Paperno. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Empire Justice Center. We'll be talking a little bit about Empire Justice in just a minute. And I work in our Civil Rights Practice Group and specifically in the area of police reform. And I am honored to work with both Katie Blum and Alex Dery Snider. So I'm going to ask Alex, if you can introduce yourself, and then Katie, who's going to then be leading off on the PowerPoint presentation. And Katie, I think you were made a co-host, so you should have access to put the slideshow up.
Let me check if that's true.
Thanks, Jill. I'm Alex Dery Snider. I'm Empire Justice's Policy and Communications Director, and I am based out of our Albany office. And Jill or Katie, will you do a bit of an overview of Empire Justice Center?
Yeah, I'll do an overview.
Thank you.
I'm just waiting to be made co-host, but until then, hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. I'm Katie Blum, and I'm the Civil Rights Managing Attorney at Empire Justice Center, and I'm located in Rochester.
All right, you should be a co-host now.
Okay. It doesn't look like I'm able to share.
Share screen.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about racial disparities and low-level traffic stops. We'll talk about what they are, whether they're legal, what harms are associated with them, and what can be done to solve some of the harms that are associated with them. Before we do so, I will just provide some overview on Empire Justice Center. We're a statewide nonprofit law firm. We have 7 offices located around the state, and it's our mission to make the law work for all New Yorkers, especially those that are disenfranchised and need its protection the most. It was founded in 1973, and our current president and CEO is Kristen Brown. We employ a 360-degree approach to practicing the law. So what I mean by that is that we teach the law, we provide training and technical assistance to other lawyers, nonprofit advocates, organizations, and court personnel. In addition, we practice the law. We provide direct representation. As a law firm, we provide free civil legal services to low-income New York families, and we practice in over 30 substantive legal areas. And then finally, we also work to change the law. We do this through legislative and administrative advocacy, as well as impact litigation, policy advocacy, as well as coalition building, which we'll be talking about tonight. And so this is just an overview of how this 360-degree approach works. Okay. So let's turn now to talk about pretext stops or low-level traffic stops. So let's first talk about what they are. Just to give you some background on pretext stops, under both New York State and federal law, police need a sufficient legal reason to pull over a car, to investigate a crime, issue a ticket for a moving violation, or to stop a pedestrian or cyclist. And if they don't have a sufficient legal reason, information or evidence that they obtain from such a stop may not be used in court. They can also face other legal sanctions. And in addition, under both the New York and United States constitutions, police are prohibited from pulling someone over or stopping them due to their race, ethnicity, or membership in another constitutionally protected class. And some refer to low-level non-safety stops as investigatory stops, secondary stops, or pretext stops. And we'll talk about why jurisdictions are starting to use the term secondary stops over pretext stops or investigatory stops a little bit later. So what exactly is a pretext stop? It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's when a police officer stops an individual on the street, in a car, or even on a bike, in which they claim one reason for the stop, when in actuality, the basis for the stop is something entirely different. And the reason that they claim for the stop is usually a low-level, non-safety related stop, like not having a bell on a bicycle or having an object dangling from a rear view mirror. And then the real reason for the stop is usually for something that's unlawful. So, for example, maybe the police suspect that an individual has committed a crime, but they lack sufficient legal reason to pull the person over. And then sometimes, unfortunately, it can be entirely unlawful, and it can be based on an individual's race, ethnicity, or looking like they don't belong in an area, or that they're acting suspicious. I just want to take a moment now to discuss Philando Castile, who was a victim of one of these traffic stops. He died, I believe, in 2016. He was only 34 years old when he died. He was pulled over for a broken taillight, and it was his 46th time being pulled over. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Jill.
So we'll talk a little bit about the history of pretext stops and the current use and status of them. Next slide, please. Okay, so the history of pretext stops, depending on who you read and the theories, very often is considered to go back to the war on drugs, when the police were given extra, essentially, ammunition in a way to fight and to challenge in communities the use of drugs and the sale of drugs. And it became sometimes a war on communities. But some people actually attribute the history to go farther back to the time of slave patrols and the opposition within a community against a community. The use of pretext stops became kind of institutionalized in policing in various ways. And there is a book called Tactics for Criminal Patrol, and the author is Charles Remsburg, which is referenced in this slide. And he taught officers to use traffic stops to maximize the number of citizen contacts in vehicle stops during each shift, and through specific investigative techniques to explore the full arrest potential of each. But as we're going to be talking about, this maximizing didn't happen in every community. It tended to happen in communities of color, and we'll be speaking more about that. Next slide, please. So he had this criminal pyramid, patrol pyramid concept that he encouraged police officers to use. And much of this history of policing is not data-based. It's not based on an analysis of what was going to develop into the most efficient or most helpful way of ensuring communities were safe. But instead, it was based on theories. So this was his procedures which were taught were to develop a suspicion or sometimes merely curiosity about a driver, discover a legal justification to stop the driver, and it's usually a minor violation, and make the stop. And I want you to all think about when you're driving, if you're driving a few miles, do you engage in some kind of traffic violation? And might that be perhaps hitting the line and, but that splits the lanes? Or could it be failing to signal a turn 100 feet in advance of the turn? Because if it's not 100 feet, you have actually violated the vehicle and traffic law. So and the theory among police, especially police who engage in this kind of policing, is that if you follow a car, there will be a violation at some point. Maybe it's that rolling stop, the failing to signal enough in advance. So you've got this legal justification. Then you decide as a police officer after making the stop whether to seek to search the vehicle based on the close observation of the vehicle and its visible contents and dialogue with the driver and passengers. And they use this dialogue to assess the truthfulness of the driver. And I want you to think about whether and how implicit biases can come into play. As we're discussing this subject, we're not saying that there are individual officers that engage in individual racist acts, but that a lot of what has become institutionalized has also become partly motivated by institutional and systemic racism. So it's not the officers making these individual decisions, but they are following protocols such as this criminal patrol pyramid. Then the officers search the vehicle. They may discover contraband or weapons, make an arrest, and they seek bonus benefits, which can be the vehicle gets impounded, now it gets forfeited, and there's more cash that comes to the police department. Next slide, please. And this is a slide relating to the increase in male incarceration rates following the implementation of the war on drugs in 1971. So you can see the steep rise in incarceration there. Next slide, please. Now, in Rochester, let me give you a little background about myself. I was a public defender for 35 years at the Monroe County Public Defender's Office. And one of the things that was the scourge of our practice was our young clients, or not always young clients, but being stopped for things, and they were young male, Black and brown clients primarily, who were stopped for things that my neighbors and friends in our whiter communities around the city, in the suburbs, were not getting stopped for. So some of those were an object dangling from the rear view mirror. They would get stopped because that is a violation of the vehicle and traffic law. They would get stopped for walking in the street when the sidewalk was available. They would get stopped for failing to signal a turn 100 feet in advance of that turn. If they signaled at 50 feet, that was not okay. They would be stopped for it. And we, as public defenders, as I was at the time, would wind up going out and investigating and measuring, is this 100 feet or not, when we were trying to do hearings to challenge some of these things. And then no bell on bicycle, which was one that we saw used time and again. And I can tell you that I live near the bike path. And I, for most of my adult life, never had a bell on the bicycle, and I was never stopped, nor was anyone I knew, but many of my clients were. And many of my clients were stopped for these low-level stops repeatedly. Next slide, please. So we want to make a distinction as we're talking about this between safety stops and pretext or secondary stops. Katie mentioned that we're going to be discussing the language. And so she told you pretext stops are when an officer stops someone for a low-level or low-level non-safety stop, but they really have another motivation. But as you can guess, it's difficult to figure out, does this officer truly have another motivation? And the stops go beyond just these pretext stops that are applied with racial disparities. There are also stops like stop and frisk in New York City that have been used that way. So there's been increasing use of the language secondary stops to describe these low-level non-safety stops that reflect these racial disparities. So pretext or secondary stops are usually stops for minor non-safety related offenses. And that's different from traffic safety stops. Traffic safety stops are stops that are made to ensure safe roads, such as speeding, reckless driving, blowing through a red light, things like that. And that's conduct that truly endangers those on the road. And one of the interesting things is that studies show there are fewer racial disparities in the safety stops. So, and studies also show that people generally understand the necessity for true safety stops. Next slide, please. This is another person who died as a result of a stop. This image was taken from Sandra Bland's dash cam video. She was pulled over for failing to signal a lane change, and she died 3 days later in a Texas jail. Next slide, please. So I want to share with you and invite you to take a look at our report on pretext stops. In January of 2023, Empire Justice issued a comprehensive report on pretext stops, the law behind them, the harms that come from them, and different kinds of solutions that may exist to reduce or eliminate the racial disparities. And we'll get you a link to that in the chat a little later on in this meeting. And Katie, all yours.
Thanks, Jill. So now that we've discussed what pretext stops are, let's discuss what is wrong with them. So it turns out there are many harms that are associated with these stops. The first is that there are racial disparities in who gets stopped. In addition, these stops do not increase protection to communities. They diminish a sense of citizenship to those who are stopped and create a second class of citizens. They present a danger to those who are stopped, as well as a danger to police. In addition, they increase distrust in police. They impact education, mental health, physical health, and also have an impact on the use of institutional services. So now we're going to go through these harms in more detail, and we'll discuss some research surrounding each. So we'll start with racial disparities. Low-level stops that are done for investigatory purposes are often tainted with racial bias. This quote is from a book called Pulled Over that was written by Dr. Charles Epp. I believe he conducted his research in Kansas City. And this quote summarizes some of what Jill was talking about earlier about the institutional practice versus a couple individual officers' racial motivations. Simply put, what has emerged in the past 2 decades is an institutionalized practice rather than the haphazard activity of individual officers. As police professional associations and leaders in the past 20 years deepen their commitment to investigatory stops, the practice has become more widespread, frequent, and racially discriminatory. There have been a lot of studies conducted on traffic stops around the country, and each study shows the same result. Pretext stops are conducted in racially disparate ways. Simply put, people of color, and in particular, young Black men, are stopped and searched at higher rates than white people. So one example is a study that was conducted in published in June 2022 that analyzed 10 years of traffic data in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. And this research revealed that police pulled over Black drivers at 2.3 times the rate of white drivers for non-safety violations, like having an improperly displayed license plate or a single broken taillight. And in some parts of the county, including Boston and Winthrop, police stopped Black drivers at rates closer to 3.8 and 8.9 times the frequency of white drivers. This is another study that was conducted. It was published in 2019, and it looked at 100 million traffic stops around the nation. And researchers found in this study that Black and Latino drivers were more likely to be stopped and searched, even though they were not more likely to carry contraband. In 2015, California passed a state law that necessitates police to collect certain demographic information in all stops, including racial demographic information. And as a part of this law, this data is collected and published each year. And so in January 2023, as a part of this law, California released its annual report. And this report stated that in 2021, people who were perceived as Black were searched at 2.2 times the rate of people perceived as white. And those who were perceived to be Black adolescents, so between the ages of 15 and 17, were searched at nearly 6 times the rate of those perceived to be white youth. And this is still part of this California law and research. So at the conclusion of a stop, police officers have to report the outcome, like no action taken, warning or citation, or arrest. And for individuals who are perceived as Black, officers reported no action taken approximately 2.2 times as often as they did for individuals who were perceived as white, which is important because it indicates that a higher rate of those stopped who are perceived as Black were not actually engaging in unlawful activity. And in addition, Black children, so ages 10 to 14, and adolescents, ages 15 to 17, were detained curbside or in a patrol car, searched or handcuffed during a higher percentage of stops than any other combination of race or ethnicity and age group. So right now in New York, there's actually no statewide requirement that racial demographic information be collected for vehicle and traffic law violations. But that being said, some cities around the state, like Buffalo and Syracuse, have actually passed ordinances requiring the collection of this information. In Buffalo, this ordinance, I believe, was passed in 2021 or 2022, and research found that in 2023, Black people were found to be 3 times more likely to get stopped by police than white people. And in Syracuse, in 2021, research showed that police pulled over Black people at a rate 7 times higher than white people.
And I just want to note, when we're looking at these statistics, these are the raw numbers we're looking at, but when you think about the relative proportions within our communities of Black population and white population, you can see that the disparities are even that much more stark. So in terms of the public safety question, do these stops enhance public safety? And do these stops enhance road safety? They do not substantially increase protection to communities. So there are some examples that have been generated from different studies and analyses, again, around the country. According to, now this is talking about secondary stops, because in this particular example I'm about to give, it's the stop and frisk in New York City. But according to a 2014 study reviewing young adults' experiences with stop and frisk, 0.11% of all stops turned up guns, and 1.5% of all stops turned up other contraband. Next slide, please. And there was a study in Nashville commissioned, and I believe it was after the mayor of Nashville was stopped, but it was commissioned for the NYU policing project to do the work for Nashville. And what they concluded was that traffic stops did not appear to have any significant impact on long-term crime trends. As the number of traffic stops declined between 2012 and 2017, crime rates remained flat. So they were reducing the number of these kinds of stops, and crime rates didn't change. If there was a component of increased safety with these stops, as they reduced the stops, you might expect that the crime rates would go up. That was not a finding. Traffic stops also did not appear to have any effect on crime in the short term. And this was sophisticated analysis. As officers increased the number of stops in a particular area, crime did not necessarily fall as a result. In some weeks, officers made an above average number of stops, crime went down. But sometimes crime went down without any change. And sometimes crime would go up despite the stops. And I'll point to something that is not in our slides. There was a study or law review article just released in the last month or so about Ramsey County, Minnesota, which is St. Paul, where as they began to reduce the number of stops for these low-level non-safety stops, the findings of weapons remained flat before and after the change in policy. Next slide, please. And non-moving violation stops rarely lead to an arrest or the recovery of drugs or weapons, which is some of what we've been saying. And this is from the NYU policing project, again in Nashville, for every 1,000 non-moving violation stops, just over 2% resulted in an arrest or the recovery of drugs or other contraband. And what I want to share with you there is that contraband included marijuana. And in some places, in New York, for example, marijuana is now decriminalized. And so it would not, finding contraband, I don't know how often of these 2%, they didn't break out the statistics in what we were reading, but that could easily be a number of marijuana cases. Now, it's not on this slide, but in other studies we've looked at, it's less than 1% that lead to the finding of guns. And so, or dangerous contraband. So what I want you to think about is, if out of every 100 cases, 2% lead to contraband and less than 1% of that 2% lead to the finding of dangerous contraband, that means that 98% of those cases, those people who are stopped repeatedly and with racial disparities, are facing the many harms that we're going to be talking about, or that we're talking about now, but we'll continue to talk about, So it's like a 98% fail rate of, if this is the purpose, then it's not working. Next slide, please. Before I move on to the creating a second class of citizenship, I want to also point out that in Connecticut, there is work that's been done on these low-level stops. And when they reduced the number of these low-level non-safety stops, stops for DWI went up 250%. And so what the person who runs the project there has said is that it's not less policing, it's better policing. It's a reallocation of resources that makes a difference. So going on now to creating a second class of citizenship. This is, again, this is from Suspect Citizens, another book, and it's what 20 million traffic stops tell us about policing and race. And the quote is, considerable research has shown people who feel they are operating within an unjust system perpetuated by government agencies are less likely to engage with that system. They are less likely to vote, less likely to contact elected representatives, less likely to contact government agencies, and less likely to cooperate with government agencies. They may even avoid things many of us take for granted, such as being involved with our children's schools. Many may avoid engaging with welfare or unemployment offices, even to request aid to which they may be entitled. In short, such individuals can pull away from government in all its forms. And I want you to think about the idea of if you're stopped repeatedly, does it feel like, show me your papers, like you don't have a right to be on these streets? Next slide, please. Danger to citizens, we have already mentioned, and this is another slide relating to Patrick Loyola, a 26-year-old Congolese refugee who was fatally shot in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and this was in 2022. And there's another quote there, but I think we're going to just move on to the next slide, please. Danger to citizens during traffic stops alone. Police have killed nearly 600 people since 2017. And I believe we put this slide together in 2023, so it's a little stale. And Black drivers account for 26% of these deaths, despite Black people making up only 13% of the population. Next slide, please. And there's a danger to police. So this is what's called proactive policing. They're not responding to a situation that's occurred. They are injecting themselves into people who are just moving or going about their lives. And so what does happen sometimes, because it's unpredictable and because it's this kind of proactive policing, is that police wind up in situations that they can't predict, and they don't necessarily anticipate. And that heightened concern on the part of the police often leads to the danger to citizens as well. So the police don't know who's inside a car or whether there are weapons, and traffic stops are by far the most common police encounters with civilians. Officers have a reason to be wary, as I just noted. So this was from 2021. 10 officers had been killed that year in interactions with the police. I'm sorry, with traffic stops, including a Chicago officer who was shot in August by a passenger during a traffic stop for an expired registration. Next slide, please. And this is an officer in Syracuse. And this was in, I think it might have been 2024. Yes, it's 2024. Next slide, please. There's decreased trust in the police. So when we're thinking about community safety, what we also want to think about is that the police, in order to do their jobs in investigating more serious crimes, more serious offenses, they need to be able to go into the community and ask those questions and have the trust of the community that people will talk to them. So in stops, as this notes, again from Pulled Over, the book Pulled Over, racial minorities are questioned, handcuffed, and searched at dramatically higher rates than whites are. They are much more likely than whites to perceive the stops as unfair, and they distrust the police in general at much higher rates than whites do. On each of these dimensions, the racial gap is wide. So while this may be an effort to engage in enhancing community safety or public safety, we're suggesting to you it's a misguided effort, and it actually has the opposite effect. Next slide, please. And there's harm to mental health. So this is from a 2019 study in epidemiology, psychiatry, and this is an analysis of contacts with persistent police exposure and mental health. And the upshot of this is that the findings supported a preliminary evidence of an association between persistent police exposure and poor mental health status. And then it says this is a salient finding given the apparent pressure the Chicago Police Department is under to increase the number of street stops. So I think we can go on to the next slide here. And there's harm to physical health. Policing can have a harmful effect on adolescent sleep and stress as well. For example, in a 2020 study, researchers found that youth who had been stopped multiple times by police had 140% greater odds of suffering from sleep deprivation and 100% greater odds of having trouble sleeping most nights of the week. So I just want to ask, what are we doing to our children? What are we doing to the people in our community who face these stops time and again? The odds of sleep problems increased by 97% for youth who reported multiple forms of vicarious exposure to police stops, which included both witnessing and personally knowing someone stopped by police. Even being stopped by police only a single time led to sleep deprivation and trouble sleeping. Katie?
Okay. And there's also a harm to maternal health. Police stops have been linked in studies to depression, anxiety, and other mental health consequences in mothers. So, for example, a study was conducted in 2017 in the Atlanta area, and this study found that Black pregnant women who anticipated that their children would have negative police encounters were more likely to suffer from depression. And in addition, women who agreed that Black youth face an increased risk compared to other children of having negative police encounters experienced antenatal depression symptoms at a rate almost 12 times higher than those who did not. In 2021, a research article was published, and researchers found that mothers of children who were stopped by the police were 69% more likely to experience depression-related sleep difficulties and were 79% more likely to experience anxiety-related sleep difficulties. And so recently, we've begun a national conversation about racism as a public health crisis, as well as health disparities. In particular, health disparities in Black women and how they're more likely to die during childbirth or suffer complications. And so I just invite you right now to think about how these stops can contribute to those conversations and those findings as well. And there's also an impact on institutional services. So as part of our work with clients, we sometimes have clients who don't show up to appointments or miss important appointments or meetings, and we often wonder why. And so the Vera Institute for Justice has actually addressed this in a concept they call system avoidance. And they stated, so researcher Sarah Brain developed the theory of system avoidance based on the impact of criminal legal system contact and specifically measuring police stops and arrests on a person's willingness to engage with social institutions. The formal records generated after contact with police may increase the risk of system-impacted people being monitored, rearrested, or otherwise punished if they engage with private institutions or public welfare agencies that track and assess this information. And as a result, people may refrain from accessing these services. Vera also found that people who were stopped and questioned or arrested by the police decreased their formal interactions with important social and welfare institutions like medical, financial, civic, and educational institutions. People with an arrest had 29% lower odds of having a bank account, 30% higher odds of being out of work or school, and 29% greater chance of failing to obtain medical care when needed. People who were stopped and questioned but not arrested had a 33% greater chance of failing to obtain medical care when needed. And on the other hand, arrests had no statistically significant effect on relationships with non-surveilling institutions like volunteer or religious organizations. And in the book Pulled Over, the authors address disparities in policing communities, noting that Black drivers are more likely to be pulled over in majority white communities. And it was noted by the Brookings Institute that more banks are located in majority white communities. And then finally, there's also an impact on education. Teens who are stopped by the police are more likely to report greater disengagement from school the next day, and racial and ethnic minority youth reported more invasive police encounters than white youth, which this is according to research that was published by the American Psychological Association. And so when I'm not doing policing work, I spend a lot of my time doing education work, specifically school discrimination. And one of the aspects of school discrimination that we've been looking at is disproportionate discipline, and in particular, something called the school to prison pipeline. And so this pipeline refers to the fact that Black and Brown students are more likely to be subjected to exclusionary disciplinary policies like out of school suspension or even in school suspension than white students for similar offenses. And as a result, they're more likely to miss class, they're more likely to drop out of school, and they are also more likely to engage in the criminal justice system. And so again, I would just invite you to think about how these stops can contribute to these negative educational outcomes.
So what can we do? And at this point, I'm going to invite Alex to join me in discussing some of the upcoming slides here. Next slide, please. Well, one of the things is using the new language as we've talked about, and that would be calling these low-level non-safety stops secondary stops, as is used in legislation that is developing across the country. So there are cities and states that are starting to develop laws relating to this. Primary stops are safety stops and stops for other reasons than low-level traffic violations. Secondary stops would be low-level non-safety stops. Next slide, please. And Alex, did you want me to take this one, or do you want to take this one?
You can go ahead, Jill.
Okay, just let me know when you want to grab the slide. So there are different kinds of responses that can occur to these secondary stops. One is there are cases that go to court, and then after they go to court, judges may write legal decisions, and that creates what's called case law, legal decisions that govern what police organizations may do and how cases can be prosecuted. In case law now, some courts are revisiting prior analysis of these stops. And because in New York, it's really hard to challenge these stops in criminal cases, and generally they don't arise, people don't have the resources to challenge them when they're stopped on the street for civil matters. And so it's very difficult, but there are some cases that now that are making it a little easier, but it's still very difficult. There can be challenges to district attorney policies. So in some district attorneys' offices around the country, and for example, Philadelphia is an example of this, the DA's office developed a policy, and in St. Paul, Minnesota now, where they are not using evidence that's generated as a result of one of these stops in prosecutions. So that's a disincentive to the police to engage in these stops, even though the law permits them to. There are police policies. Some police departments, like out in California, are starting to tell their police officers on the force not to engage in some of these stops. And there's legislation, so that can be at a list, well, theoretically at a national level. We don't expect that to happen right now, but at a state level, and we will be talking about that. And there can even be, as Katie noted before, local ordinances such as those in Syracuse and Buffalo right now. And, you know, for the clients that we have, for people that we know who are stopped this way, one of the responses can be understanding and support, because these very often, and people I've spoken with over the years, happen time and time again in their lives. And that's usually Black and brown men and teens. Next slide, please. Okay, so Alex, why don't you talk a little bit about laws and policies and how public campaigns can affect change, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, that's great. So as Jill mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that we can respond to these stops at different levels. And so we are focused on legislations at the state level. And I don't know, that's a slide in a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So, so we're tracking some of the things that are happening statewide and in other communities and nationally. Are there other things you wanted me to cover here, Jill? I'm sorry.
Oh, so in terms of how we can generate, when we have support for this, what kinds of things we do to make a bill pass? And we'll talk specifically about the bill, but you're the bill maven.
Yes. So as I'm not sure how engaged folks have been with legislation at the statewide level, but generally, we work in conversation with the legislators to introduce the idea, and then where it's about building support, making the case, socializing the idea, addressing any concerns. And certainly sometimes with legislation, when there are things happening at the local level, that can be sort of a good testing ground. It can sort of address concerns and say, like, see, the terrible thing you were afraid of didn't happen, or like sometimes you get to work some kinks out and say, you know what, it's really important to make sure we include blah blah blah. So it can be helpful for progress to have things happening at multiple levels sort of simultaneously.
Thank you. And one of the things that Alex does is she figures out, and she has experience in this, she's had success with it, what is it we need to do to develop a campaign to support a bill? And that's what we're going to be working on and developing support from across the state. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are different kinds of legislative responses, barring racial profiling, which can be difficult because it's vague. And then an officer comes in and says, I wasn't racially profiling, I just saw them engage in this stop, which was what was raised in the Wren and Robinson cases that we mentioned earlier. The courts said, well, we can't look inside the minds of police officers. So if they have a legitimate legal basis to stop someone, even if it's no bell on a bicycle, we're not going to do that examination. But there are ways of barring racial profiling in legislation. Barring secondary stops, limiting searches, requiring data collection, review of the data, and transparency. That book, Suspect Citizens, had used data that was sitting around for 10 years because the legislation didn't require the analysis and transparency. It required the collection. So nothing was done with it for 10 years. Limit the use of evidence in cases and limit stops for particular warrants. Next slide, please. And that's where we get to this bill. So the bill that we discussed, that we have proposed and that was introduced last session is New York Senate Bill 7111A, and it does many of these things. So it does have a component that bars racial profiling. It requires collection of demographic and other data, including and especially racial demographic data by local police departments on a statewide basis relating to low-level non-safety stops. I mean, it relates to all traffic stops. It bars vehicle and traffic law stops of motorists, pedestrians, and cyclists based solely on secondary stops. So if they're stopped only for a bell on a bicycle, it would say police can't do that. If it's a stop for a moving violation and a non-moving violation, a moving violation that is considered a safety stop, like speeding, and a non-moving violation like that item dangling, that would be a lawful stop because there's a safety component there. It adds requirements such as written consent to consent searches of vehicles, and it limits stops for certain low-level warrants. Next slide, please. And so making the case to end secondary stops, we want to share the stories of those who were stopped. And so we always ask the people that we speak to, if you have a story, if you know someone with a story that's willing to share it, we would do it, anonymizing the person, but we believe that gathering those stories and sharing them will help make a compelling case for the public and ultimately for the political leaders that we want to persuade. And we have started a coalition, the Safe and Fair Traffic Enforcement Coalition. It meets the third Wednesday of each month on Zoom at 4 o'clock. We had a meeting today. We want to encourage people from all sorts of areas of interest: medical providers, mental health providers, teachers, doctors, those who have interests in a variety of ways to join us, because we think that the harms that are created cross many communities and communities' interests. And so we want to get you involved. So we also have a newsletter that we put out once a month. If you'd like to be in our coalition, you can join us. We can get you that information. And eventually what we're going to be looking for is people who want to help us by signing on to letters and engaging in lobbying. And Alex, do you have other things you want to share in this?
Yeah, definitely. And I see a question in the chat too about the status of the Senate bill, so I can answer that, which is, as folks may know, the New York State legislative session is from January through June-ish. And it didn't pass this last session. We were working on getting it introduced and starting to build support for it. So it'll be reintroduced before the next session. We'll have a new bill number, and we'll be working on building support for it and getting it through the committees it needs to move through. I think as Jill mentioned, there's like a number of different elements that would be helpful. And, you know, you go in with like the gold standard bill. It may be that we pass a chunk of that first and then more later or something like that. But that's where we are right now. Does that answer the question? And we do have, I should say, we do have an assembly sponsor as well who'll be introducing the same as in New York State. Unlike in Congress, you have to have a same as opposed to like passing two slightly different versions and then duking it out. So that's an important thing. And we're starting, you know, building our target list, like who are the committees, who are the potential allies, who are the people that might have concerns that we can talk to and address those sooner. So that's just all the campaign work. So.
Thanks, Alex. And I think, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think we have one more slide and then we have Q&A, but if you have something
Great.
else right now, I can. Oh,
Nope.
okay. So, and I don't recall what, oh, so what else can we do? Support further legislation, support policies of any police department that prohibits or limits pretext stops. And I will say that we're going to be working to try and convince the local law enforcement agencies to make some changes because we know this legislation may take a while. And in the meantime, people are being harmed every day and we want to make those changes. We want to try and get local ordinances passed. We want to support policies of any district attorney's office that prohibits or limits pretext stops. Question candidates about this issue. You can speak out against pretext stops to your legislators, news outlets, and in public forums. Insist on collection and sharing of data by police departments. And if you're comfortable, as I noted before, share your story and support us in our work to end pretext stops in New York. So I think, is that the last slide? Maybe. Oh, and there's some resources here, so you're welcome to. We can share this presentation with you, and then you can use the links, and you can sign up for our newsletter. And that
And I
may
put
be
the link for the newsletter in the chat too, so people can
great.
do that right now.
So thank you, and I think that's the end of it then. So if there are questions, we can have that conversation.
There's a question in the chat, Jill, from Barbara. Barbara, did you want to ask that or do you want?
Yeah, so I was reading recently that in Rochester and Monroe County, they don't keep any data on racial demographics for these stops. So it seems like a nice place to start to so what who do we lobby? Is that the police or we try to get the county ledge to pass something? How does that work?
Well, that's a series of great questions. So we've started focusing on Rochester Police Department because that I think is the lion's share of these low-level non-safety stops because the sheriffs, they certainly have their share, but they also do a lot more road patrol on the highways. So if the lion's share is with the Rochester Police Department, that's what our focus is. They are governed by the determinations of the mayor and the city council, so they can set ordinances just as Buffalo and Syracuse did. In terms of lobbying the leaders in the police department, I don't know. Right now, we're talking to some of them and we're hoping to create some change there. But in the meantime, I know that we want to try and get a meeting, with the mayor, and also we want to talk to city council about it. That is probably more likely influential for those who are city residents than those of us who are county residents. And then we will be talking, we are also starting conversations. We had a conversation recently with someone in the sheriff's department. And so we're hoping to do that as well. But I think the district attorney's office can create some policies, and she is a county-wide officer. So that could be something that's done. So I would say the district attorney's office, perhaps, the mayor, the city council. In terms of the county executive, I don't know that we'd be very likely to persuade him in the county ledge right now, but it's something, if we can get to the sheriff, I would say that's a good start. No harm in trying, though. So we haven't really worked out the county strategy as much as focusing right now on the city a little bit.
I love your suggestion of asking candidate questions on this because we do run
Mhm.
candidate forums. So we will make a note of this and certainly do it. Could you talk more about the state legislation? Because I didn't really totally understand what it
Mhm.
contained.
Katie, do you want to take that or should I?
Yeah, do you just want another general overview or do you have specific questions about the bill itself or the process?
Yeah, what's in the bill and how far did it get? Where's it stuck?
Okay, so the bill was introduced last session by Senator Hoylman Siegel in the Senate. Um, it is going to be reintroduced. It didn't gain much traction just because, as Alex mentioned earlier, last session we spent time finding the right sponsor and getting it introduced. And so now that it's introduced, it will be reintroduced in the next session. It will get a new bill number, and it's also going to be introduced in the assembly as well.
Yeah, Katie, just on that in terms of like, I think Barbara, our strategy for this is that we know that that people need education on this topic, that there's going to be some pushback, and it's important to like get our foundation right. And I'm thinking about this as like, we need to get the groundwork done first. So like, for example, Empire Justice puts out a policy priorities every year. Last year we chose not to put this out because we wanted to like make sure the bill was introduced. It was the way we had it. We didn't want to like draw attention until we had the foundation set. So I think we need to do this bill in particular, we need to do this in the right order in terms of building support, getting co-sponsors, like so that it'll move well once it starts to move. Like if this draws attention of the wrong people too soon before we've had a chance to like
Yeah.
explain it, then that would, I think, not be great in the long run. So we've been focused on like, and we will be focused in this next session in terms of education and gaining support that way. So I hope that answers your question.
So, I mean, most leagues, and I think we have 37 leagues around the state, most of us lobby all of our assemblymen and senators each year. So like we would really like to help get this
Fantastic.
bill
Yeah,
further.
we can maybe, I know, and I don't want to lose, you had another question about the components and Katie's the right one to talk about that, but Jill and Katie, let's talk about afterwards. Maybe we can come up with a blurb, and Barbara, we can work out sort of like ways that you can get engaged, because that would be fantastic. We'll need a lot of muscle.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting in December to meet with our assembly people already.
Great. And so as far as the components of this bill, there are 5 major components. And so one of the components is barring police officers from stopping an individual solely for a list of identified secondary stops. And so the bill identifies 24 secondary stops. And so these are low-level non-safety stops. And so if passed, police wouldn't be able to stop an individual solely for that reason. But so basically the bill separates stops into secondary stops and primary stops. So primary stops would be stops that aren't the 24 secondary stops. And so usually these would be safety stops. So if someone is pulled over, for example, for speeding, which would be a primary violation, and they also have an object dangling from their rear view mirror, which is one of the secondary stops listed, they could get ticketed for that. But if it's only the object dangling from the rear view mirror, they would not be able to be stopped for that.
Mhm.
And so then another provision is the data collection piece. So as we've mentioned, there isn't a uniform data collection requirement in New York State right now. And so this bill would change that. And it would also require that this data be made publicly available and reviewed. And the third component is a bar to racial profiling. And so this bill, if passed, would provide a mechanism, a hearing, and Jill, correct me if I'm wrong on this piece, a hearing. So if someone wants to bring a claim that they've been racially profiled, then there is now a hearing that they can go to in order to prove that claim.
In criminal court. So if
Yeah.
the basis for the stop was, and they would have to allege that it was primarily based on their membership in a protected class, in order to get the hearing, and then they would have to actually prove that somehow. So it's not just simply making a claim, but it's a evidentiary hearing where the judge would have to determine, was this person pulled over primarily based on their membership in a protected class. Does that make sense? Or you need more?
Yeah, I'm just a minute. I realize how little I know. Did the police have to say why they stopped someone? Can they say you look suspicious or?
If they say that, it's less likely that a case will hold up for them as if they say, you had an object dangling from your rearview mirror, so
Okay.
I'm stopping you for that, and I don't have to give you any other reasons.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so that's the combination of preventing the secondary stops and having that kind of forum seems like potentially pretty powerful. All right. Have other people got questions that they want to ask?
There's some other questions in the chat too.
Yeah.
Has the rates for pretext stops increased as the ticketing people for driving at excessive speed decreased? Jill or Katie, do we have any data on that?
I don't know the rates for that. I know that there is data out there, and one of the members of our coalition did share some of the traffic safety data, but I just don't recall it at all. I
The reason I asked that question is I have not seen a cop ticket anybody for going 90 miles an hour on the highway. However, when I've asked the cops themselves, they say we don't have enough staff.
Yeah, and so that gets to the argument about allocation of resources. So as we said, police officers don't have unlimited resources, and because these stops are so ineffective at reducing crime rates or promoting traffic safety, it's our argument that they would be better off allocating resources toward stops that could actually promote safety, such as excessive speeding.
The reason I was asking that, because I used to work in juvenile justice and mental health, and I just can't understand how, well, the other question is about the deportation, which is not my question, but I think that's a really good one too. About, are they going to use traffic stops to identify undocumented immigrants for deportation? Do we know anything about that?
I think we can only guess and fear what the efforts are going to be. I expect that public transportation, anytime, that the buses and trains are all going to be manned by police who are looking and asking questions, or ICE or Homeland Security. I think we may find in bus stations, at the court, various other places where in recent years, they have not been allowed to do these things, at least by community sometimes in a broader basis. I just think we don't know yet what, and maybe if we read Project 2025, we'll have a better sense of it. I haven't read it myself.
Is there any way also of having the police, because I've worked with the police, retrained and be held accountable for their racial bias? There really needs to be training on how they see people.
There is training that occurs locally in the police academy. I would suggest that it's not enough, and that when you have a police department that has a history of what seems to be institutional bias, that it's hard to undo that with a couple of classes at the academy, especially if you're riding with someone who's a longtime member of that department. So it's a challenge. I'm not saying it can't be done.
Is there any way of writing that into some kind of law, like PS, you need to change the paradigm shift?
We might have to take that as our next project.
Okay, because I worked in mental health and I worked with the kids here in juvenile justice in a Watgurn industry, and it was the staff that was the problem, not the kids.
Sure.
Well, isn't a lot of the data that you were talking about being collected by the officers themselves?
The data that we talked about from other jurisdictions is collected by officers, and that's why sometimes you'll see the language perceived as Black, perceived as white, because it's what the officers can't ask the question. So instead, they write down what their perception is, and they're required to do that based on legislation or policies of those police departments in those other jurisdictions. Here, it is in police reports on crimes at times, but it's not always filled out. And on the violations, it's just not required. And we are seeking to have that change done here.
So the ones that are filled out are just on a form, they're supposed to fill in the spaces?
Yeah, a form can be created or spaces turned on digitally on forms.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there,
I think there's a question in the chat about gender bias. Are women stopped?
Katie, do you want to take that or should I take a?
I can start. So much of the research that we have found shows that in particular, young Black men are stopped the most. I think that there tends to be a gender bias towards stopping men from what I remember from the research.
I don't have anything to add there.
Can you, Jill and Katie, there's that data about after sunset that's really interesting.
Yes, so there's something called the veil of darkness. And in this field of analysis, and there are a lot of social scientists studying this, several have suggested or found in their findings that after sunset, there are less racial disparities. And the theory is that the officers cannot see who is driving the vehicle to make a determination of race. And so it's just less racially disparate. Are there any other questions?
All right.
I'm really
I-
thinking about that last piece. That's very interesting to think about.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking about Philando Castile getting stopped 46 times before they killed him.
Yeah. It's weird. Katie and I have talked to different groups, and we've talked to some that include professional men who were professional men at the times they were stopped. And even I think we've both talked to people where we've heard that professional men were shot, at least one, and I thought there were two that we've talked to.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This was very informative, and we look forward to working with you in the next session of the legislature.
Thank you. We're so grateful that you had us tonight.
Good to meet you
grateful.
all.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Yeah, and we have members in the city, so if we're gonna, I would love to see us reaching out to city council, the mayor's
Let's
office.
strategize. Yeah.
Definitely
Wonderful.
count us in.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.